In just a minute. Thank you for being here. This is our Dignity in Schools campaign panel on DSC Decodes Project 2025 and the perils of inadequate education reform. I'm going to take just a second to introduce our panelists. First, I want to thank them for being here. First, we have Ben Palmquist, who's with us from Partners for Dignity and Rights. We have Elsa Benuelos-Lindsay from Movimiento Poder, and we have Gada Makoshi of ACLU of Pennsylvania. My name is Natalie. I'm from the Dignity in Schools campaign, and Tafari is here also from the Dignity in Schools campaign if you want to say hello. He's also going to be helping with the Q&A and the chat. So we will talk a little bit about what is in the release that we shared, I guess, a few months ago now, called DSC Decodes Project 2025 and the Perils of Inadequate Education Reform. I think Tafari is going to put that in the chat too. I just wanted to note that the document was written before the election about the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 policy agenda. It was definitely not about one candidate or the other. But it was meant to highlight the failures on all sides to deliver an education system that is actually meeting the needs of students and families. The Trump campaign repeatedly attempted to distance themselves from it before the election, but we could see that the stated agenda had a lot of overlaps. So now that we do know who the next presidential administration will be, and they have announced their cabinet appointments, many of whom are authors of Project 2025, during this panel, we'll kind of be talking interchangeably about the ideas that are contained in the Project 2025 policy agenda, the Trump campaign platform, and generally what we can expect from the next administration. So first, I'm just going to review very quickly some of the key points that were in the piece that we released. One is that disinvestment in the education system and ongoing inequities has led to a lack of trust in public schools, leaving a lot of room for the arguments to dissolve the Department of Education or expand privatization to grow. And for all its flaws, the Department of Education does have a critical role to play, especially in the protection of student and family civil rights. They are falling short of their mandate, but complete elimination of this oversight role will only hurt. And then kind of from a campaign and organizing perspective, we can see that many terms and ideas have been purposefully distorted to confuse people. So we have to be really specific about what we're calling for and what the long-term vision is. We proposed in the document assessing proposed policies or our own campaign demands by asking the following questions. Will this result in less or more openings for youth, parent, and community member decision-making roles? Less or more protections for marginalized students? Less or more transparency for how funds are spent and decisions are made? And less or more options for families to have recourse for when things go wrong? So that's just a very quick summary of some of the key points that we wanted to lift up from the document that we released. But now I'm going to turn it over to some of our panelists and get their responses to some questions that we have for them. So I'm going to start with questions for Gada and Elsa. Can you give us some concrete examples of communities that are already marginalized by our current system, who are likely to face even worse conditions under the next administration due to the ideas promoted in Project 2025? And I can start with Gada.
Natalie. So much of the work that I do at the ACLU around education equity focuses on the disparities particular students face when it comes to equal access to education and discipline practices. And historically, the children that have been the most harmed have been students of color, particularly Black students and students with disabilities. And when there's an intersection, for example, a Black girl with a disability, those disparities have been quite significant. Project 2025 proposes to roll back Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that prohibits the discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in programs and activities of any entity that receive federal assistance. So What that would mean is that states would no longer be required to follow federal rules that ensure students with disabilities receive the services they need. For example, current law requires schools to set aside a portion of their funds for early intervention programs to help young children with disabilities. Project 2025 would seek to eliminate this requirement, potentially reducing support for students who benefit most from early help. And as it currently stands, we already know that the federal government only funds about 14% of the cost of special education, which is far below the 40% that was pledged when the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, was passed. But families with kids with disabilities can't afford for there to be less investment in kids with in their kids when schools are already struggling to provide it, or in some cases even fighting actively against providing appropriate resources and support. Additionally, one of the proposals includes rolling back protections against the over-identification of children of color as students with disabilities, undoing federal laws that address racial disparities in school discipline, which has already been a target in school districts across the nation with the attack on DEI, anti-CRT, and other similar attacks. So in my work, and I'm sure there are others that see the same, we already see how students of colors with disabilities disproportionately face harsher punishments and less access to appropriate educational services. Any further dismantling of these protections at the federal level would lead to significantly higher levels of disparities, some of which we've seen in some of our smaller districts, especially where Moms of Liberty and others have taken control of school boards. So the proposals in Project 2025 would dismantle a lot of the safeguards and supports that have been built over decades that ensure that students with disabilities receive a fair and equal education. Namely, they would do this by reducing funding, removing accountability, and limiting access to inclusive public education. And I think one thing that's important to realize is that these threats don't only come from one side of the aisle. We have lobbying from both sides to push aspects of these plans forward at the state and federal level. So I think we will continue to see the turning of public schools into an underfunded institution that can no longer serve all of our students, particularly those with disabilities. And the result would be a deepening divide between our students with disabilities and their peers, undermining really the progress that we've made towards a more inclusive and equitable education system over the last few decades.
Thanks, Gada. Elsa?
Yeah, thank you. Here in Denver, so we're Movimiento Poderes in Denver, Colorado. And historically, we have done educational justice and primarily working with the Latin community, most of whom are first generation or immigrant families. Just recently, we had to fight school closures. The school board has given our superintendent a lot of power to make decisions that are harming our children. In the recent move was to close 10 schools, and most of those schools were primarily in our communities, in the working class immigrant communities. The whole entire board did vote to close these schools in supporting the superintendent. At the same time, the city did pass a mill levy to support funding of some of the schools that were closed. And as much as we pushed for them to be transparent, they were not, and they lied to us. They're like, we're going to use these buildings for something else, but in reality, they got funding to upgrade a lot of this and to allow charters to open in those same buildings. So we're seeing this huge move of privatizing our education here in Denver. And it's happening. It happened under people we thought were allies, unfortunately. And I think that with the new administration, it's just going to get worse because we have our friends, right, who are setting they're setting the stage to really, really undo a lot of this stuff. School closures didn't really impact a lot of our families. Our families didn't know it happened so fast and sneaky. Some of our families, especially our immigrant families, are really, really afraid of what's to come. Especially they're like, where am I going to go? I don't have a car because I don't have a driver's license. So just adding more barriers onto our families. And then also just thinking about like these, like the fear of mass deportations and families feeling like, is it even safe to take my kids? One thing that's being uplifted in terms of like the Project 2025 is the undoing applier versus Doe, which protects our undocumented children. And if that is something on the docket for this administration, we will see more of our children not accessing any education. So if folks know, that is the law that was passed, I believe in the 90s, to protect undocumented, or 80s, to protect undocumented children. So that allows our undocumented children to go to school, and schools are not legally required or cannot ask for a social security number to attend public schools. So if they get rid of that, it will really, really impact a lot of our children, not just in Denver, of course, across the country. So a lot, yes. So a lot of the privatizing our education. Denver has been on the move on just replacing a lot of these schools with charters. The area that we live in Southwest Denver specifically, they're mostly charters. 90% are charter schools. And the district is allowing that to happen. So the word of school choice is big in Denver, and it's starting to pick up a lot. One good thing is that in Denver, we were not allowed to, voters did vote against school choice for vouchers. So that's a good thing. But again, it doesn't stop them to introduce that again next year with the new administration and conditions. Especially if the buzzword, right? It sounds really nice, like, oh, I have a choice to send my kids somewhere else that's nicer, but don't know the implications of that. So yeah, so just it's really honing down to like the fear on our immigrant families, first generation, our mixed status families, hearing and listening to the incoming administration saying, we're not going to separate you all. We're just going to just deport you all, even if you're citizens. So that's also creating a lot of stress with our families, especially with families with children in their schools.
Thanks, Elsa. And for Ben, my question for you is, we think of the public school system as an example of a public good. How do you define a public good? And can you draw some parallels between like what you're hearing and what you know about the education system and the other public goods in the United States that are under attack or, prevented from being established in the first place?
Yeah, hi Natalie, thanks for having me on. Yeah, so I think of public goods as being sort of the things that we all need in life to live, healthy, flourishing, decent lives with dignity, both as individuals, as families, as communities. The things we need, but we can't provide on our own, right? So like I am not capable as an individual of just providing myself an entire education. I am not capable of providing myself housing just by myself. Like we all live in a society where we rely on sort of like cooperation with other people. And sometimes we do that, through mutual aid and things in our families, but on the level of the whole society, we also need sort of really collective structures in order to provide things like education for ourselves. And government is sort of the, one of the key tools we have, of course, to do that. And so our government has a responsibility, a moral obligation to make sure that the things we all need are actually sort of guaranteed and provided to everybody. So, that's absolutely education, but it's also housing and healthcare and income security, water, food, a clean environment, community safety. All these things are public goods. And sometimes it really makes sense, like with K-12 education, for the government to be sort of running public programs and providing these things directly to people. Sometimes, like maybe in our food system, it's not like we're buying everything directly from the government, but the government still plays a key role in making sure that we have food safety, that our farm workers are protected. There's a lot of things that the public does. But all of these things are under attack. Unfortunately, it's not just education. And I think, and it's not new, but the attacks feel especially heightened right now. But really throughout the 20th century and the first decades of this century, I think there have been forces who've been trying to roll back sort of all the public programs and public goods we have to attack them and dismantle them. And I sort of think of these attacks in a couple categories. So one, and Elsa and Gada have already been talking to these. So one is sort of privatization, right? That they're trying to take public systems, introduce corporate control, private profiteering with no real democratic accountability or decision making. So that's one set of things. And so just like we see that in charter schools, there are folks who would like to, and already are to an extent, privatize like Medicare and Medicaid and the Veterans Administration. So taking these essential public programs to make sure people can get health care and, farming them out to private insurance companies in order to create profiteering opportunities. And then the other set of things are these sort of creating this two-tiered system where, sort of essential public goods, especially for poor people, are means tested, and then those become very racialized and gendered and anti-poor. Social stigma is laid on top of them. Poor people are burdened with procedural burdens or barriers that just make it really hard. You have to do work requirements all the time and report every 2 weeks and jump through all these hoops. It's hard to find a doctor who takes Medicaid. And then there's a lot of, just like there's push out in schools, there's a lot of exclusion and push out from these public programs, right? And there's a real contrast with the what wealthier people have, which is, they'll retreat to sort of elite private or suburban public schools. And similarly, will have sort of buy their way into separate hospitals and health insurance programs. And that's actually supported by the public in really unfair ways, so that people, for instance, like people who have private health insurance, like that is actually sort of tax deductible. And so wealthier people tend to pay less taxes on that. And people who own houses, their mortgage interest is tax deductible, and there's no equivalent for renters. So there's a lot of things in the sort of public policy already that both parties, Republicans and Democrats, have supported. But I think what we're facing now is really, it's uncertain where this will go, but really probably potentially heightened attacks on each of these systems, on our healthcare, on our social insurance system, on all these sorts of things.
Thanks so much, Ben. I was thinking about the concept of means testing actually when Elsa brought up Plyer v. Doe, like the idea of barring a family or a child from attending schools because they don't have a social security number. There's many circumstances, including immigration status, that would make you not have the proof, that you were born here. And so whenever you add a layer of means testing to any of these systems, you're more likely to create a barrier to even more people than you were, originally intending to. I'm going to ask a question to Gada now. What has been your experience as you have navigated using the limited federal tools that we do have for accountability over local and state systems, for example, like civil rights complaints, in your personal and professional life?
Thank you. So the Office of Civil Rights, OCR, have three basic functions. So monitoring, which is under the civil rights data collection, enforcement, which is through complaints, and then guidance. And what we've done is we've used that in terms of the guidance that OCR has released. So I'll provide some context. Some of the most recent guidance they've issued were a Dear Colleague letter on race and school programming to guide schools on lawful programs to promote racially inclusive school communities, clarifies the circumstances under which schools can, consistent with Title VI, develop curricula or engage in activities that promote racially inclusive school communities. They issued a fact sheet this year about how OCR determines the existence of a hostile environment and details the school's obligations to address and remedy a hostile environment. So in our work, we've used examples of OCR determinations or complaints filed against school districts with regard specifically to disparities in school discipline to support the changes that we have requested school districts make. So for example, the Office of Civil Rights made a determination about a high school, Victor Valley High School in California, where it was found that the district engaged in disparate treatment based on race through its disciplinary practices in violation of Title VI. And they concluded that they discriminated against Black students specifically through various disciplinary practices, including citations, issuing citations. So these guidances and determinations have been important in my advocacy work. When we're working with the school districts to say, here are your responsibilities, here's what OCR has found. And when it comes to more of my personal life, although I have used the federal guidance, we are fortunate to be able to have a, although not always clear, sometimes vaguely written, but our Department of Education has some clear guidance as well for students with disabilities. And so when it comes to my own child and when I'm advocating for the schools in terms of FAPE, so free appropriate public education, I've used a lot of the determinations at the state level, the guidance that they have when speaking to the school district. And I think that with Project 2025 and the changes that we see and any of the revisions that may happen to OCR in terms of overturning some of the guidance or issuing new guidance, there will be more reliance on some of the state regulations and some of the state guidance that they have. But yes, that if in the past, historically, OCR has been very important in the advocacy work that we have done.
Thanks, Gada. So I'm going to ask a question that anyone can jump in and answer. So in our DSC Decodes Project 2025 document, we reference the anti-critical race theory panic and the growth of right and center-right grassroots organizing like Moms for Liberty. One tension that came up at that time, and I wonder if we've fully reckoned with, is how, we have always been calling for more parent, student, and community voice in decision-making around curriculum and all kinds of aspects of education. That's not at all at odds with what we're calling for. And so we saw a lot of, from that world, parents' rights type of policies where maybe there are aspects of them that we would support in terms of, more participation for parents, students, and community members. However, we have seen now that that type of participation structure leaves the door open for groups that are calling for hateful or otherwise harmful policies. It gives them the space to enact their views. Have any of you seen that in your community, and have you been able to counteract it in any way? And I'll let anybody jump in.
Can jump in. So we have seen some of that in some of our school districts in Pennsylvania, and some of that is work that our legal department does, where they've used the federal guidance and state laws to back up claims. The plan moving forward, I think, is that if federal guidance is overturned, then we would use things like the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, which issued new state guidance. So, they've issued new regulations, for example, clearly explaining the definitions of sex, religious creed, and race. And those have been used when we are, we've gotten complaints about trans students being able to use the restroom of their choice in certain school districts or book bans. And of course, we know that state regulations vary from state to state, but that is one thing that we would be using and have used here. I think an important part of the changes, though, which is something that you mentioned, was the community involvement. And so, having parents speak up at public hearings. And we partner a lot with some of the grassroots organizations like 412 Justice, which gets families and community involved to speak up. So speaking at school board hearings, running for school board, holding your school board and superintendent accountable. And much of the work that we've done has been successful when we've had parents and community members come to the table. So whether they're involved, whether they're putting pressure on school board members, they have then reversed some harmful policies as a result of people speaking out. And I think what's often misunderstood, especially at a local level, is how much power parents and families and community have, because not enough people speak up at these public hearings. And if they're not, then the school board and the administration don't feel as though they're accountable. And so coming to those meetings, really putting pressure on them, whether it's through the public hearings, whether it's through the press, however it is, to just say, we don't agree, we want to be more involved, we want more accountability, and we want more transparency. Um, so that's what we've seen success at, is really when we get people in the community involved.
I'll just add that we are seeing that, not Denver specifically, I think because Denver is really diverse, and I do give credit to the district on that. They are very inclusive of making sure that they uplift Latin communities and African American communities, and so they're very proactive. But talking to the union, the teachers union, they are seeing that a lot in like these pocket rural areas. Because in Colorado, it's like there's the mountain area. There's pockets of people testifying or anytime they can to dismantle a lot of that as well. But there's not enough allies to be able to counterpose that, unfortunately. So some of these smaller communities are being impacted. And I think we're going to see even more of that moving forward. And it's a lot of these mountain areas also do have a lot of immigrantes because they work there at the resorts, like the ski resorts. So we'll be seeing a lot of that impact as well in those smaller mountain communities.
Thank you. And so, we're hearing about both in places where, where there's maybe a minority of hateful voices that are having, an impact and actually changing things, as well as places where it is unfortunately the majority as well. So it's like can happen both ways. And then of course we did see many places that were very successful in shutting that down because I guess the positive side had like the majorities at debates and things like that. So kind of in that vein, Ben, can you share more about your research on people's assemblies as a tool for gathering community input and perspectives? And I know this is a big question, but in general, like when you're doing that type of work, how do you deal with those questions around like majority, minority, in terms of perspectives when there is a sizable number of people in a community that do have support for these types of, harmful policies?
Yeah, so we've in recent years been sort of increasingly exploring with our grassroots partners, what are the actual tools and structures for, participatory collective decision making. And assemblies are one of many tools that sort of are a good vehicle for that. And the idea though is not that they're, just everyone's always agreed and totally on the same page about something. You're trying to build consensus, but often people are coming in from different places. And so, a lot of it comes down to good facilitation in the space, but I think actually sort of some of the most important things are what you do outside of an assembly and beforehand in order to sort of help build the groundwork in terms of, organizing people in the community, bringing together, likely, but maybe also unlikely sort of coalition partners to sort of build some common cause about what are we trying to do, because the initial sort of framing, whenever you convene a space for sort of democratic deliberation with people, and this could be true of city council hearings or any number of things, school board hearings, how you sort of set the stage, like what values are we sort of coming together around, what are our goals here? Are there things like, excluding people from the community that are just like a line that cannot be crossed and are off the table? Really matter. And then, once you sort of lay those ground rules, I think that facilitators are creating space in assemblies and other places for people to really be heard and listen and think out loud together without being judged. And sometimes people may come in with, what some of us might think are sort of questionable positions on things at times. But or community organizers often talk about meeting people where they're at. And so the idea is when you're having a conversation with someone, you're doing a lot of listening and, over time trying to sort of like move people into sort of towards sort of ideas and collective decisions that are sort of more about community care and collectivity and that kind of thing. But it is a challenging process. And I think, that happens within the microspace of some assemblies, but I do think it's something we're dealing with on a societal level right now. So it is a big challenge.
Thanks, Ben. And related to that, Elsa, as a leader of a base building organization, do you have any tips for other organizers who are navigating the impacts in their communities of Project 2025 or Trump-related mis and disinformation, harmful right-wing ideas kind of growing in popularity, or other tensions that are being stirred up right now?
Yeah, I think that just historically looking at movements, this is not, unfortunately, the first time, right, that our communities are being under attack, is just the resiliency. And I think that bringing community together and inspiring hope through being actionable, like through actions. Right now, we're building up a network, like a rapid response to that's really youth focused and their families, and figuring out, like, also coming up with like tools and kits to be able to prepare any type of mass deportation. And I think that when, organizing just in general does inspire some hope, it helps with some mental health, like just it just provides that. And I think that really inspiring hope by building an organization that feels like a political home for our families, where they can come and get those tools, where they can get trained on their rights, where they can also know, like, what's coming down, what's on the horizon in terms of policies. So really just working with them and bringing more people along is what we're really, looking to do, because we are seeing an increase. And I think that, being like, even just going back to the school closure piece, a lot of those parents that came, like, we were legit in the mornings just like, hey, did you know they're closing your school like next week? And families were like, what? And they would come. And we even had healing circles. That's another piece, another component of our work, is really having that space for people to talk, to just navigate those feelings, and then, talking about like these solutions. So, for example, like those parents making the connection and being like, you know what, like, this is really hard, but this is happening across the country. It's gonna get worse. Let's start learning. Let's dissect this like 2025 project. Like, let's understand so we're prepared. And the more information we have, we can also kind of eliminate a little bit of the fear, and just be prepared. So again, just inspiring hope through organizing, agitation, healing, and providing that space of hope.
Thanks, Elsa. We also wanted to, I shared it in the beginning, but I can repeat it again, like this assessment kind of set of questions to help us figure out, if something that's either someone is proposing as a demand internally or something that, is a possible law or policy change, is it really something that's going to help us in the long term? And like the example that we gave of something where, charter schools often do and sometimes have data to show, in short term, maybe sometimes, that, for example, they are educating Black students better than the local public school or whatever. There often is like a racial justice argument for the charter school in the short term, whether it's true or not in every individual case, of course. But, the answer to all of this question, it is in basically every charter school, that there's going to be less openings for youth, parent, and community member decision-making roles, less protections for marginalized students, less transparency around how funds are spent and decisions are made, and less options for families to have recourse when things go wrong. Often they're kind of sent back to the public school. And it's often not really recorded in data anywhere, where it went wrong. And so, especially in a time when, like I, shared in the beginning, terminology, things like equality, liberty have been really taken and distorted to mean something actually like literally the opposite of, the intended meaning. Anyone can jump in on this. Can you share anything about how you make the type of assessment? Like, is this a short-term win that could damage us in the long term? Do you have any examples of like how you make that type of assessment, or examples of where you had to change what you were calling for because, of what you saw? Anybody can jump in on that.
Touch on it briefly. So I don't think that we have necessarily changed our demands or what we're calling for. And much of our work is focused on a kind of a very local level. So, again, we work very closely with grassroots organizations. We work with individual school districts to strengthen school district policies and regulations. And I know you mentioned that about charter schools, but I will say the one thing that I think people don't often look at when they are looking at different schools and their success rate is the disciplinary practices. And when I look at discipline across all schools, there are pretty significant disparities in suspension rates at charter schools that either are the same as some of the local ones or significantly worse. And that's something that I think people don't look into enough. But, in terms of things that we have called for, and I think is something that more school districts could do, are, there's an inclusive sanctuary school policies that I think the LA school district may have implemented or is trying to implement, but it includes not just immigrants, but also Black students and students with disabilities. So it's kind of a broader policy, inclusive curriculum policy. A lot of the things that we call for are just changing things at a very local level. And sometimes what has to change is the narrative. So not necessarily what we're asking for, but maybe how we're phrasing it and how we're talking about it and what the strengths are, what the opportunities are in making these changes and how it actually benefits the school district. Much of what we do is not, it's not a got you. We're not trying to figure out how school districts are messing up. What we're trying to do is say, here are some resources, here are some support, here's some different things that you can do that really strengthen your school, that really help support your students. And I think those are the types of things that we will continue to do and that what we have done. It may just take some narrative changing, not necessarily a change of what we're asking for.
I can chime in with an example from one of our healthcare partners. So we work partners for dignity and rights, partners with grassroots groups, not just in DSC, but also in other sectors. And one of our longtime partners is also in Pennsylvania, Put People First Pennsylvania, which is organizing people around the human right to healthcare. And I've learned a lot from them over the years, and their sort of North Star is really a commitment to seeing healthcare as a fundamental human right that everyone should be guaranteed, and they're calling on the state of Pennsylvania to step up to do that by really creating essentially Medicare for all or Medicaid for all. That would sort of everyone as a resident would just automatically be able to get the healthcare they need. But through years of organizing, it became clear that the state politics are not quite there yet, and Put People First and its allies don't yet have enough power to really drive that through. And so partly by looking sort of, okay, power mapping, where are the political openings, but at the same time doing really deep community organizing across the state and hearing from people in different communities and rural areas and urban areas, what healthcare issues are coming up for you. Put People First decided to focus in on a few sort of what I think of as like stepping stone goals. So one was the state cut dental care out of the Medicaid program for adults, I guess, under the assumption that poor people don't deserve healthy teeth. And then private hospital companies have been shutting down hospital facilities across the state. And insurance companies have been jacking up insurance rates year over year. And so these are sort of deeply felt issues that are really showing up in people's lives. And so without sort of turning away from their long-term goal of, winning a universal healthcare system, a public system for everybody, they've sort of focused in on these fights over Medicaid dental care and hospital closures and insurance rate hikes as sort of shorter term winnable things that they're sort of organizing people around, but not to just win those and stop there, right? But in order to keep fighting that longer term fight.
Thank you, Ben. Elsa, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I'm just going to add that I think that for like long-term, like assessing policies, we just earlier in the fall produced our Student Bill of Rights, and we're constantly, but we just know that that was even just a long-term platform for our young people, and really looking at what can we do now that doesn't cause harm long-term as well, but also like, unfortunately, we're going to have to be in defense mode because the population we work with, like, especially even just being in Colorado, like you all heard about Aurora. Aurora is like legit just like 20 minutes from here. And our mayor just also like targeted himself and said that he'll like protecting immigrant families. So I think that there's this feeling of like we might be like a proof point, like this is where it's going to probably start here in Colorado. So just really looking at our Student Bill of Rights and ensuring that we're still staying true to that and we're uplifting young people and their families. So yeah, just wanted to throw that out there as well.
Thanks, Elsa. And I think we can move into some of the questions that we are getting in the Q&A chat. And I'm going to turn it over to Tafari to kind of facilitate that section.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again so much for joining. Panelists have been really offering a lot of, I think, poignant offerings about their local organizing work, kind of the broader contours of, what has happened and how that's leading to the continuation of kind of the policies and practices that, again, continue to contribute to privatization and the atomization of communities, which, frankly, make it easier to exploit, to just sway away from building the types of communities and the connections that we'd like. So it's deeply important, to, if this conversation has interested you in any way, please connect with these organizations to read the DSC Decodes, which is an emerging series that we're going to start doing in this kind of model. And we do have a couple of questions in the chat. So I'm going to let folks kind of come on. Andrew, one of our members, one of our coordinating committee members, has a question that he would like to come on in and ask. And I know Cheryl, you have one as well. So I'm going to let Andrew come in and ask his question, and then we'll kind of keep it rolling from there. All right, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Hey, everyone. Thank y'all for sharing such wisdom and your invaluable perspectives. I'm Andrew Hairston. I serve as the co-chair of the Dignity in Schools campaign nationally. I wonder, in all of your local organizing, these fights are just so imperative. Fighting for quality public education, I think, is what brings us into this fold most acutely. But in some of these broader fights for the public good, for accessible housing, for living in dignified wages, beautiful public spaces, how are you seeing some of these intersecting fights uplifting each other? And I think particularly for Ben, how are you seeing some of these people's assemblies that you've engaged with share knowledge and exchange information among each other across state lines?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. That's such a great question. I think I'm seeing some of the connections and think we could always use more so that, I think as we've been talking about the both our visions and values and the things we are all fighting for and not, don't just stop at education, but everything's interconnected with the immigration system and healthcare and housing and where families are living. And so I don't feel like I have a great answer for you. I mean, to some extent, I think it's sort of, it feels like narrative strategy is important of us sort of connecting the dots with people. And that's both in public messaging, it's also in one-on-one organizing conversations, sort of at all levels of like helping draw the connections that we see right between these different spaces. Because part of the way, sort of government and the economy and things are set up is actually to divide these things in people's minds. And so I think we're working against that. But beyond the sort of the narrative piece, I think one of the hardest pieces is actually figuring out where everyone is so busy, right, working on each issue. How can we sort of like create shared spaces, coalitions, peer learning exchanges to sort of like co-strategize a little bit, because the same attacks that are happening in education are happening elsewhere too. And also the same proactive, like beautiful things we're building, right? Like there's a lot of parallels in other spaces. And so, yeah, with assemblies, I think, I think Tafari shared a link here in the chat to Project South is helping coordinate Southern Movement assemblies. I think regionally, they've done a really beautiful job of linking people across the Southeast and sort of who are running assemblies to really come together and learn from each other and grow that. But we need more of that. And so I think, I, among other people, are trying to sort of help facilitate some of those linkages more nationally. But I think that's like you're asking a question that like I think you're really hitting on something that is something we all need to keep figuring out together.
Okay. Would anyone else like to hop in on that question as well? Got Elsa? If not, no worries.
It's definitely a conversation that we've had, especially on, kind of what Ben was saying, and that it's all interconnected. And I think that is something that we don't consider often enough. For example, when we're talking about school discipline and we say that a kid is kicked out, right, or they're suspended, or they're somehow in contact with police, each of those interactions have another impact. So, for example, not just on the kid, but also on the people that witness it. But kids that have interactions with police, whether something happens or doesn't happen, are less likely to then be engaged in school, to get grades, to graduate. That has an impact on their community, right? So kids that don't graduate, kids that aren't able to then get jobs, are not able to positively contribute to the economy of that community, right? Crime rates go up. All of these type of things go up. Everything is interconnected. And I like to tell people that when we talk about all of these issues as an adult, so much of it stems from what we do with our kids when they're in school and even before, right? When we talk about pre-K and early education. And if we don't invest and really take the time to keep our kids in school and to ensure that they're successful, that has a direct impact on our community and the success of our community. And so being able to communicate that to both sides of the aisle, in that it is very important for everybody that we keep our kids in school and that we try and keep our schools successful and inclusive.
Thank you for that. All right, now we are going to go to Cheryl, who has a question from a little bit earlier in the discussion. Cheryl, welcome. Good to see you.
Good to see you all. And guys, thank you for having this panel. It's been amazing, right? This is such an important topic. My question is specifically for students with disabilities, right? So I'm here in the Virginia Beach area, Tidewater area, special education advocate. And I'm getting major panic and concern where parents really believe, like, as soon as he gets in office, that their children's special education services are going away, right? And we know that's not going to happen. He can't just make that go away. However, there's not real clear data out there about what that'll look like if he puts IDEA sped ed services under Health and Human, which is what they're projecting, Health and Human Resources or Health and Human Services. Do you guys have any idea on, like, what do we need to be telling our community about that? Like, how do we calm them? Is there maybe a hidden place that you all know where we can go to kind of review what that could look like just this school year, right? This school year and the next school year as it relates to IEPs, Section 504s, and the dismantling of the U.S. Department of Ed. Thank you. Am I here?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah,
nobody said anything.
Yes. Sorry, I think we
no,
were
you're
I think we were just processing.
Okay. Sorry.
I mean, I have joined, every webinar and strategy call since the election, and I feel like not every, but everyone that I've been invited to, around education stuff, and I feel like what everybody is saying is like we don't know, and I feel like that is part of the strategy with like of many aspects of this, like to create confusion. Like when you appoint someone like Linda McMahon to be the head of the Department of Education, if it's like even like a well-known, like super conservative or whatever, like education figure, they have some kind of footprint that you can then look like, oh, this person is always trying to push for this particular model or whatever. By, appointing these people who have like no background whatsoever in these issues, we can't really prepare in any kind of methodical way. And I think that that is definitely part of the point, especially in the education world. So like similar to what Elsa is saying about, Aurora, Colorado, or Springfield, Ohio, maybe, that when it comes to we can't fully prepare for what's going to happen with the mass deportations, but we can kind of guess because there's certain things that they've made a lot of. And so all we can do at this point in the education space, I think, unfortunately, is guess. My opinion is that they're part of why they want to part of why there is a focus on education is because there is a lot of money there. And so I don't think actually, we'll see if I eat my words, that the money will disappear. I think the restrictions on how the money is supposed to be used will disappear. Or, the fight will then be at the state and local level. And so I I imagine, there's a world where some kids get shiny new facilities because of whatever goes down. But I think the issue is that right now we have these limited, structures for making sure that students with disabilities, that funding, goes with them to ensure that they get the support that they need. I think my guess is the money will probably still be around, but the like mandate and the oversight that it gets tied to go to the students that need it most, I think is, if we have to guess, the type of thing that they're going to strip away. But unfortunately, I panic doesn't help anyone, but I think it's also not a time for calming. I guess it's preparing as much as we can, because even though it's about to happen, we really still don't know a lot about what it's going to look like. Those are, my opinions, I think, because it's really uncertain, unfortunately.
Thank you. It's scary though, right? Not to know, not to be able to, you know.
Yeah, and I think one thing to keep in mind, especially when it comes to funding, is that often, quote unquote, red states are more dependent on federal funding. So that is another thing to consider. But we brought up the dismantling of the Department of Education, what they actually think would be really quite complicated. So even if it were to happen, it would take a long time to do, because then you would have to reallocate where all of those decisions are made and where all of the different things go. So that would not be something that would happen soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, but in relation to what you were saying in terms of IDEA, I would say that a lot of state laws have some, regulations and support for students. So, in Pennsylvania, state law mandates that kids be treated fairly and in a non-discriminatory manner. And so school districts aren't relieved of their obligations, even if federal guidance changes. And a lot of states have that in their regulations and in their state law too. So we just may be more dependent on state law than we are on federal guidance and regulations.
Thank you very much. There are no more questions in the chat. Again, we are live streaming on YouTube on the Dignity Institute's website. We're nearing the end of our discussion together. So this is just another check-in with people that are in the chat. If there are any questions that you have, please share them now or later. This clearly is not the end of this discussion by any stretch of the imagination. If there's something that you like, please note that and share it. I think one of the things that is consistently clear across the terrain of organizing is that the more we can connect people and educate people, including ourselves, about the nature of these grassroots and granular strategies and tactics, where people can coalesce into decision-making entities and activating entities to not just counteract policies that are coming, practices that are already here, but also to develop offensive strategies for protecting the things that we're trying to protect, while in turn the landscape of education, justice, and education broadly has not been ideal in the ways that we would like it to be to begin with. Hence, the organizations that we're a part of that exist to participate in making meaningful change in our communities. And so we want you all to, I think it's important for us to keep note of, this is another chapter in the struggle of organizing. And that while it's certainly important to take into account the big push to the right over the last really 35 to 40 years, that in moments of crises, we don't always have to go to the right. But I think it's part of our opportunity as organizers and organizations to make those people to people connections across the terrain of issues, and really build a mass multinodal, if you will, for a fun word, movement that does have these emphases on our particular areas of expertise. But if there are things that you all are hearing or seeing, please don't hesitate to continue to let us know. And in the same way, take this video and share it. Take the DSC Decodes piece and share it. I tried to also put links in for each of the organizations that are present here. And please, connect with them so that, again, they and we can continue to know that, people are really trying to figure out a lot at the same time. This is where organizations and organizational technology, if you will, like Ben's representing with people's and movements assemblies, this is where we can come together to really make decisions about tactics and strategies and political education to engage where we are. So please really take on that opportunity to do so. But I know there was one more question that I think, Natalie, you said you had before we start to transition to a close. And if, of course, there's anything that the three of you all would like to add, we can do that as well. So, Natalie, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thanks, Tafari. We released this DSC Decodes Project 2025 piece. It's actually maybe like the third or the fourth DSC Decodes kind of project that we worked on. We started using the terminology around decoding really like summer 2020 when all of the anti-CRT stuff was happening, and it became, just complicated very quickly around like what types of terms were being manipulated so quickly. Social and emotional learning, for example, they were trying to twist to like grooming children. It was rapid fire, one after the other, and the idea of decoding what was going on is like something is a word that like popped up a few times as we were talking about it, and so We did a DSC Decodes on neoliberalism. We did one on, understanding data, on school discipline stuff. So that's something we're going to continue working on. This is maybe a kind of bigger lens than we usually apply to the work. We've often been pretty focused on education. So we are starting our next strategic plan in 2025, and we have determined that we wanted to focus on narrative power building and political education work. And so this is an example of like the types of things that we hope we're going to be able to do more over the next 3 years. And, one of our first steps is to figure out, like, amongst our members, what does that mean for us? What is narrative power building? What types of political education do we want to focus on? Things like that. But one way that we're thinking about it now is that we want to change like the common sense about what a good school looks like and how we should treat students who are struggling. And so I think my final question for you guys is, are there any ideas that your organization or you embrace that you think could successfully become common sense if we were able to spread our message successfully? And anybody can jump in first.
I'll just jump in with a quick thought, and I just want to say too, I'm really excited about this direction for DSC. I think it seems like a really exciting, powerful strategy. Just one piece of the puzzle that I think about is who are sort of like is a compelling and powerful speaker, and like really it's like students and parents and teachers and people who are sort of living in schools and in these systems and have a direct stake, I think are really compelling. And so, I think one thing we can do is like, help sort of people sometimes call this a speakers bureau, but, really work with folks to sort of, get them ready to tell their own stories and like know, if a journalist is asking them questions, how to be prepared to respond, or if they're talking at a school board meeting, how to help them prepare for that. Because I think sort of like that all these sort of elite media discourses, are really easily manipulated, and at the end of the day, it's like who should be sort of out in front, sort of advocating for themselves as the people right in the middle. So.
Thanks, Ben. And I did not like pay him to say that, but that is like a major prong of our strategy is building for the next 3 years is building out our speakers bureau for that exact reason. It's something we've always done, but we want to be like more strategic about it and have more training and support for those folks. So totally agree. Gad or Elsa, do you have any thoughts on this?
I can jump in. Some of our common sense, it's something that we've just constantly talked to, school districts and even families, is looking at data. So when making decisions or policies, to really rely on data rather than just like your feeling or your gut. And so one example, kind of going back to something that Elsa had mentioned, was that even though I think we recognize that the overall goals of education in Project 2025 is privatization, right? So like the vouchers and undermining equity, when we look at the data. So when we look at, like, for example, the results of the general election, voucher referendums lost everywhere, right? They're wildly unpopular, but not just are they unpopular. If we look at like Arizona and Florida, they have significant deficits as a result, So those are things that are harming the states and the places that are implementing them. And if you look at that data, then it, should determine what your next course of action is. But that's really, I think, what would be the common sense for us is like really look at the data, really look at what's actually happening.
That's a good segue for myself. I think that is really important. I think that doing some political education to be able to agitate and bring out more people is really needed. Just going back to our school closure work, we did a lot of data. We put the facts out there, and it still was not enough to be able to do that. And I think that what we need to do is mass turnouts in the coming, the next 3-4 years, and also just accountability of even our allies, right? Because sometimes they like I say, they kind of just go with the flow, and really holding them accountable too as well, right? To hold the ground for us and just be really principled. So yeah, just second everything that you all have said already, but really I think the political education is going to really support with the data, but we really need to really focus on mass turnout. People just need to be out in the streets. And I think that combining all of that narrative building up speakers is definitely going to be needed. And I think that the more we can be in these conversations on a national level, just really just to echo that right throughout the country it's going to be really much needed moving forward for sure.
Thanks, Elsa, and thank you again to our panelists, Ben Palmquist, Gada Makoshi, Elsa Benuelos, Lindsay, Tafari, also from Dignity in Schools campaign, facilitating the Q&A. Yeah, that was a really great conversation. We are gonna post the recording if you missed the beginning of it. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and to our panelists, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.